So as you may know, and you'll hear much more about from our expert panel, we here in New Mexico recently had a court decision, which locally we call the Yazzie Martinez, a consolidation of a couple of court cases that came together to say that New Mexico has to do more for its most underserved students. And so the implications of that are vast. And to be able to talk through some of the intricacies of that, we're going to be able to bring up a number of people who have lived this day in and day out. So I want to introduce our moderator for this discussion, Everette Hill, who is the principal and managing director for the Social Innovation Strategies Group here in New Mexico. Everette, come on up. And then also joining the panel today will be Gail Evans, the legal director for the New Mexico Center on Law and Poverty and lead counsel in the Yazzie Martinez lawsuit. Julie Radoslovich, the director of South Valley Academy, an amazing independent charter school here in Albuquerque. Kara Bobroff, our deputy secretary of Identity, Equity, and Transformation at the New Mexico Public Education Department, and a founder and former executive director of our Native American Community Academy. And last but not least, Mayra Valtierrez, director of Language and Culture at the New Mexico Public Education Department. All right. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, everyone, and I hope you have a wonderful conference.
While we're transitioning here, please give Secretary Stewart another round of applause. We've welcomed his leadership here. Been wonderful. As Secretary Stewart mentioned, part of what he's working toward and what this group has been working towards in New Mexico is equity with our students throughout our schools and our school systems. And one of the things he mentioned is that New Mexico is looking to be a model for other states. There are some intricacies, as he mentioned, around the case. And our panel today, we really want to talk through from the legal perspective, give you some more insight about the case itself, and then talk about how our state Department of Education is looking to engage that work, both in frameworks and in models, and then hear from an actual school leader to talk about how those implications from the case itself will impact how things happen in schools. And then we want to give some sense of what we think the implications are for you all that are not from New Mexico, how this case might impact you nationally. So we'll start our panel just by asking Gail, can you give us some more background on the case itself and give us an overview of what Yazzie Martinez is?
Sure. Is this working? Yes. So the case is actually very simple. Our state, like I believe every state in the country, has a constitution that has a clause in it that says that the state shall ensure that all children in the state are provided a sufficient education. And in other state constitutions, it might say an adequate education or a sound basic education, but these are called education clauses in our state constitutions. And so this lawsuit was brought under that clause, and we sued the state, saying that it is clear that the state is violating the rights of our students to have a sufficient education. And the reason we know that is because our students are not getting the programs and services and education that ensures that they have the opportunity to be college and career ready. And we know that because we look at our educational outcomes, and we look at our graduation rates, and we look at our college remediation rates, and we see that our kids are coming out of high school, if they are lucky enough to come out, because we have a very high group of students who don't graduate. And we have some of the worst reading and math proficiency rates in the country. And what we know is, and what I always say this case has been based on, are the strengths of our state. Because our state actually has figured out what our children need to do well in school. And we have a lot of expertise in our state, and we have a lot of expertise in our legislature. And we know that our children need pre-K in order to close that early achievement gap between low-income and non-low-income kids. We know that our kids need extended learning opportunities. There's lots of evidence that children who are from low-income families need extended time to learn in school, summer school, after school, tutoring. We know that our children need a culturally and linguistically appropriate curriculum. We have passed something in our state called the Indian Education Act, which lays out very clearly what Native children need to succeed in school. But all of these things are things that our state knows our children needs, and our state has chosen to only make those things available to some of our kids. And the Constitution ensures that all of our kids get that stuff. So the case is based on 4 student groups. It's Native American students, English language learning students, special education students, and students from low-income families. And the court ruled that the state is violating the rights of those 4 groups of students because those students are not getting the programs and services that they are entitled to ensure that they have the opportunity to be college and career ready. So I could go on, but I'll just end by saying that we are now in the implementation phase of that case, that we have actually been extremely disappointed with the lack of response from the state to this enormous decision, and that we are now having to go back to court really with a very simple request. And that is that we see the state develop a plan that would show how they are going to come into compliance with this court order. And this plan needs to entail a statewide capacity building so that we actually have the resources and develop the staffing and the people that we need to be in our schools providing our students with the education that they're entitled to.
Thank you. And so Kara and Myra, obviously this is not an issue that happened overnight, right? Our ability to meet our kids and provide the services they have or that they really need is not something that just happened, and obviously not something we're going to solve overnight, but leadership and moving towards equity and moving towards frameworks and models that meet those needs that Gail just talked about. Can you all say more about, as you all are kind of inheriting that work, how you plan to go about it and some of the things you've done so far?
Good morning, everybody. I hope you're doing well. It's good to see you again. So I think a couple of things that, that come to mind. One is that when we think about, well, first of all, I think an important thing that happened in January is we had a new governor who was elected and came into office, and so she made the decision not to appeal this case. It had been in an appeal mode for a couple years, and then prior to that, just a lot of things going back and forth. So really recognizing that, yes, the state of New Mexico needs to serve students better, and what does that look like? So I think that's one of the most immediate things that took place in January and February. And then our legislature invested about $480 million into, into education for the first time in a very, very long time, which is an unprecedented amount of money going into the system, both to schools flowing directly and also into different types of initiatives that could make themselves available to a variety of different students and families across our state. So I think those two things combined with the fact that there's a positive will and energy within our state to come together to be able to address some of the issues related to Martinez Yazzie is something that we're really excited about. So when we look at this from a state view, I came out of a school directly into the Department of Education roughly in February, and I think that what I think of with other school leaders in the room is that as you start to think about the needs of your students, that work really needs to take place within your community so that you're working with your community to create a school that uniquely meets the needs of folks. And I think of the charter sector in New Mexico being really a major source of that, I would say, innovation, but also track record in working with those student groups, whether they're Native American students, students that are in bilingual education programs, students with disabilities, is that we've been able to create schools that actually support students very differently, and we need to learn from that. In New Mexico, our charter sector makes up, it's the third largest district when you put all of the schools together. And so we've had some great conversations about what would that look like to learn from those schools to share those practices. So that's one thing I think is sharing what works for our students. And then the second I think is like, how do we then start to build the right structures in place so that this is sustainable over time? Because it is not going to happen in 6 months. It's not going to happen in 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years. When you think about how you develop a school from either the ground up, it takes a while. We all know it's a good 3 to 5 years as you start to grow a new school. The second is if you're in a school that you're looking to transform, that also takes a good year to think about what are the things that need to change, how do we start to implement those, and then how do we support the staff, students, and families in achieving those goals. So we're thinking of things in both of those categories. So one thing that we're doing is making sure that every single school in the state has a culture English responsive framework, which I'll ask Myra to talk a little bit more about. And that's really to be co-created with their community. So referring back to the Indian Education Act, Hispanic Education Act as well as our Multicultural and Bilingual Education Acts, that's something that can be created within a very small rural district where there's maybe 60 students, or a largest urban school district like Albuquerque where there's 80,000 plus students. The other thing is establishing an equity council at every school and within every district. How many of you have an equity council within your own school? Okay, so thank you. But thinking about how do we start to think about the student groups, how we're meeting the needs of our students, and then also how are we ensuring that we're meeting the needs of our teachers in order to better serve our students. So that's a entity that will be not necessarily a governance council or a school board, but it's really good, the entity that will be responsible for ensuring that Martinez Yazzie's the implementation of that continues on, and also that there is a connection to the community so that families understand what this means for the state and what it means for their child or grandson or niece or nephew. The other thing that we're looking at is a readiness assessment so that people can familiarize themselves with what the judge shared about what she found, and also different best practices that can be implemented within schools, and how to utilize the funding sources that come to schools as well. And then the last thing is that in our state we have a systemic way of thinking about school improvement through a 90-day dash plan, and so that we're revising that so that these things are embedded and also will be sustained over time. Now in the charter sector, I think that there's been a call for some of our charter leaders is that we want to lead in this area. Is there something that we can do now to start to move this work forward? And so we've started to think about how to network people together. Some of the things you heard from Secretary Stewart in the sense of being able to share ideas with one another as well. And then the last thing I want to say, and I'll probably come back to a lot of other things as well, is that within the agency itself is how do we start to change the work that we do at the state level so that we're thinking of culture English responsive education, working with students with disabilities, as we're building out granting programs, professional learning opportunities, and then working with our regional education cooperatives across our state. There's about 11 right now, and then our higher education entities as well. So this is really far-reaching, and it does take everybody to be able to come together to come up with the solutions that make sense, but it also has to happen within the communities we serve. If you think about, I don't know how many of you heard from the different students here yesterday, but they were able to articulate the uniqueness of their school and why that worked for them. We want every student in New Mexico to be able to articulate the uniqueness of their school and why it works for them, and what makes that a more responsive education so that they can go on to follow what it is they want to do and achieve in life. So I'll just stop there for a second.
Thank you. Myra?
Good morning. Buenos dias. So I come to this work having been one of the underserved children. I'll start there. And then continue into the fact that as we've been working internally and really building resources and guidance, we began some work. So I'll just start with the story of where I've been this calendar year. So we started some work with 5 districts that that applied to be part of launching this work. And so we've been working with 5 major districts in the state to see what this would look like, particularly because we know that a lot of these schools have been in place. And so again, we're talking about transforming schools that have been in place and really rethinking what they do for our children. And so that work included an equity team internally. So they've had these teams, we push them to have conversations around readiness and what they're doing. Those were really interesting conversations and really asking them to think about who their underserved children are, how resources are being allocated, and then really having shared language on how we talk. So what is equity in our district? What is a culturally and linguistically responsive education? What is the difference between what you teach and how you teach? And so that's the work that we engaged in since February is when we started that work, and have moved into the second year, and then working with a couple of districts and some charter schools this year. And so from that work, we've learned and have guidance on how to do this. And so as Deputy Secretary Bob Roth was talking about having equity councils, the readiness assessment, it's really an iteration of that as we learned and lived it. And as far as charter schools, I think what's really exciting is that many of the schools haven't been around for that long, and they were built to be specifically responsive to our children. So that work is really exciting. I've had conversations with various charter leaders that have told me, we've already got this done for the first time ever, we're ahead. And I have some that say, we have something, but we haven't formalized it. And so I've said, this is the opportunity, right? So we're really excited about that work with charter schools and making sure that they can really share what they've done to make sure that they're responsive to their students. And then thinking about how do we do this for the entire state. I think we have 854 schools. And then we have districts that are there to support those schools. And so we have 89 districts, all very different, from very large to rural, and very specific. And so as we think about this work, I think when I look at the challenge and I really think about what we're up to, I have to remember that this work is grassroots, right? Like, it happens in the classroom, it happens in a school. Serving children is happening there. And so what can we do as leaders outside of the classroom, all of us up to the state level, to make sure that we set those teachers up for success, right? That we are setting up our schools up to be able to do that. And so those are the things that we're thinking through. Also, while honoring that some of our schools have done this already, that some of our schools will need a lot of support, that our districts will need support to support their schools. And really be able to do what's right for our kids. And then also, the case is very specific to 4 groups of students, but we have underserved students depending on the community that we're talking about. And so again, thinking about grassroots, who are the children that you're serving? In the northeastern part of the state, we have a large farming community that's been there for a really long time. We often don't talk about that specific culture and the realities of that community. And then our African American students are rather underserved, particularly in the eastern part of the state. And so as we think about this work, is how do we make sure that we do right by all of our kids while we think about those 4 student groups that were identified. And so with the CLR framework, what we're asking is for individuals to think about what is the framework that you will use in your specific school to serve the children that are there. Not the ones we wish we had, the ones that are there. And so what are their cultures, what are their identities, and what are their needs? And so really being cognizant of what we believe about our children and why, and really being clear on who we are and our identities, and then also what are the expectations we have on our children and where do they come from. And so it's really about transforming ourselves as individuals, but also coming together as a community.
Perfect. Thank you. And Julie, as a school leader in a rural area with a dynamic population of students, what are some of the things you all are thinking about at the school level and doing as you respond to?
Yeah, so I'll share a little bit, and I know we'll go into challenges later. So my name is Julie Radoslovich. The kids call me Miss Rad. It's like the coolest name ever, right, for a school principal? So when Alamar Sankata Sandoval opened South Valley Academy 20 years ago, so this is our 20th anniversary, the local comprehensive high school in the community graduated less than 30% of the 9th grade students with which it started. And of these 30%, only about 10% went to college. So folks who cared about equity for low-income, largely Mexican South Valley students started South Valley Academy. So today, our school serves almost 650 students. 91% qualify for free or reduced lunch, 90% of whom are minority, mostly Mexicano students, and 90% attend college. Our English learner population is 32%, which is twice the average of our local district authorizer. And we have over an 80% graduation rate for high school, so we're very proud of that. But it hasn't just happened, right? We've had to really provide a supportive, rigorous academic environment. We were built upon the idea that all students could succeed when given supportive, rigorous academic environment that was honest about academic skills, strengths, as well as deficits. And it's allowed students to dream and demand the most. We do have a social justice framework at our school. So we're grounded upon social justice. Students examine the world in which they live through critical social justice theory. And students in grades 9 through 12 participate in the service learning program that culminates in a senior action capstone project based on research and very much on personal interest. So we really do try to create an environment that is demanding, but also supportive. The other key piece I just want to I'll just draw your attention. So I'm still learning. I grew up in the South Valley. I'm white, and I'm a white leader, and I've had to really spend some time thinking about what that means in my community. And so there's a couple different texts, and I have different ones here, but the one I want to quote is one about, is everyone really equal, and how we can't deny our prejudices. And so here's an author, Sensoy and Delangelo, examine how prejudice is built on socialization. So the quotation I think is really important for all of us to keep in mind is that all humans have prejudices, but they are so normalized, and I'm going to take it, it normalized for me as well, that we take them for granted, and they're very difficult to identify. So this is one of the challenges of critical social justice theory. You have to develop the critical thinking that would enable us to bring our prejudices to the surface and reflect upon them. But yet society tells us that it is bad to have prejudices, and thus we feel pressure to deny them. And so we have an equity table at our school that's allowing us to have the conversations, and we can't deny them. And so it's been really interesting. I'll just give one example and I'll pass it off. But even at the equity table, we have a share out space, and we recently had some of our teachers who are native Spanish speakers, and they talked about the burden that they have as folks who do speak Spanish to interpret frequently. And just how do we compensate those teachers? Do teachers have the capacity to say, no, I have other work I have to do, I can't interpret right now? And so even those kind of conversations have been interesting. And so I think the equity table for us has been dynamic and allowing us to grow.
Perfect, thank you. So there's a lot of work that's being done. There's a lot of work that we still need to do as a state. And part of, I know some of the folks that are here are from out of town. We want to think about, from what we've just heard about how we're starting to move this work, what might be some of the implications or some of the ripple effects from this case here in New Mexico that you might experience in other parts of the country. And just ask each of you from your perspective, what are your thoughts about what might be the implications of a case like this for folks in other parts of the country?
So I would start by saying that I really suggest that you all read the court decision, because I've been told that it is one of the best, if not the best, most comprehensive decision that's ever come out of one of these cases. And these cases have been filed in like 45 states. But the judge really does lay out sort of what the evidence showed around the needs of these four groups of students. And so I think it's just a good tool. There's a decision, and there's something called the findings of fact and conclusions of law, and they can all be found on the Center on Law and Poverty's website. The other thing that I think we're doing, the advocacy groups and the plaintiffs in this lawsuit, and it's a large group of plaintiffs, which includes school districts and families, is that we have really developed a a platform, what we call our remedy platform, about what we believe it would take for the state to come into compliance with the judge's ruling. And what's different about what we're doing than what I've seen in some of these other cases in other states, which seem to be much more just about funding. And people always ask me, is this case about money? And it's like, well, really what this case is about is ensuring that students get the education they're entitled to and the programs and services that they're entitled to. And those things cost money. So I guess it's about both. But we've been really talking about the need to develop the capacity across our state. So this is not just about the state increasing the education budget by $400-some million, which, by the way, did not even get us back to our funding levels from 2008. So it didn't even get us back to where we were, and we were broken back then. But it's not just about that, and it's not just about adding a few programs here or there. It's really about looking at how does our state agency, the Public Education Department, what capacity does it need so that it can do its job with all of the districts? And it's about what do our institutes of higher education need so that we can develop more teachers. We have a massive teacher shortage in this state. What do other places need so they can develop a rich, culturally appropriate curriculum for our students? There are centers around our state that have the expertise to do that, but they don't have the funding. What do our rural areas need so that they have Wi-Fi? A lot of our kids don't have Wi-Fi. So that's why this really is a statewide, cross-agency, cross-branches of government. We need a big response. So even though, and I think we've really shown that, and we've really developed that, and there's been a lot of work that's gone into that, and I would be happy to share that with anybody. And you can also find me on the New Mexico Center on Law and Poverty's website, and I believe our platform is up there, as well as the court's decision. But I think that would be useful stuff anywhere.
Okay, thank you. Others' thoughts about implications for folks from other states to be thinking about how this might impact them?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this, and I'm going to echo some of the things that Gail mentioned, because I think it's super interesting to think about the challenges we have as school leaders. So the first I want to talk about is licensure challenges. That's one of them. In New Mexico, we changed from using a licensure testing exam and moved to Pearson, and our licensure pass rate about 5 years ago was around 90%, and today it's around 65%. So we have teachers that can't pass some of these exams, and I'll give one example that I'm thinking about. We have a Spanish teacher at our school who is trained as a lawyer from Colombia, and she has not been able to pass the English writing exam. She's a great teacher. Like, why are we going to keep her out of the profession? She's got one more year to finish that writing exam. I don't know if she'll pass it or not, but why do we have exams like that that keep native Spanish teachers out of the classroom potentially? So that's on my mind. Similarly, social studies teacher, the math exam has changed. There's some statistical analysis, and I don't know that I need my social studies teacher to calculate standard deviation. Like, there's just certain things that I just want to make sure that we're not keeping certain folks out. So that's on my mind. And we definitely have an educator shortage, and even trying to balance some of the additional money that we got for at-risk. Do I give teachers who are TESOL or bilingual endorsed extra money, or do I use that extra money to provide a social worker to support our students? And the other big one that I'll talk about is our at-risk factor. So one of the challenges that we have is as a charter school, we take our district's at-risk factor, which is not as high as our own. And so one of our governing board members a few years ago did a white paper analysis, and basically our school loses about $110,000 a year because we do not use our own at-risk factor. And I know that's something that the state is really thinking about considering. And then the last thing I'll mention is that we have spent kind of 2 years really trying to understand how some of the new calculations for Title I funding may be affecting our population, and in particular, the way in which Title I had been implemented was that certain kids were not counted because they did not qualify for programs like TANF or Medicaid. And so our undocumented students were not being counted. And so again, money lost, we couldn't do some of the programming. I think we've worked through that issue now, which I'm pleased about, but it's almost like that constant fight of, are you paying attention carefully to what is happening at the systematic level?
Perfect. A couple more thoughts, and then we want to open up to questions.
I really just wanted to just add to that by saying that as we think about transforming education and thinking about it being something grassroots, what we have thought about internally, and Deputy Secretary Bobroff can add to that, is what do we need to do to think about the needs at the local level, and then make sure that our policies and our guidance and our administrative codes and then our statutory requirements are aligned, so that we're not building, so we can eliminate any barriers that exist in order to serve our students. As far as federal funding, that's definitely a different conversation because we are a funnel, and there are things that we are responsible for, but even within that, if we have wiggle room to really make sure that we're responsive. And so those are some of the conversations that we're having internally, particularly those of us who are middle managers and oversee these funding sources and this work and really lead around policy.
Perfect, thank you.
I think, so we have the opportunity through both NACA and the NACA Inspired Schools Network to work with a variety of indigenous communities across the country, from South Dakota to Oklahoma, Colorado, as well as California, and some folks in Arizona, and then also just thinking about how to share our work. So I think that one of the implications is definitely, if, as a charter school leader within your own community, and since we are all, seem to be really, I would say, very grounded and committed to the independent charter school movement, you know, the idea of replication, expansion, and growth is not necessarily something that we all gravitate towards, nor do we want to have a cookie cutter answer for every single community. So I would say some of the implications are thinking about how to share the work. Some folks have started fellowship programs where you're able to actually have school leaders who are aspiring to change their school, redesign their school, transform their school, or start a new school, have an opportunity for a 2-year kind of experience that would provide the support and capacity that they would need in order to do that around any given, I guess, mission or vision that would be co-created with their school. Also, something that Maida was sharing earlier is that we are working to co-create this process. So where we have a systemic framework in place, we want to know from our school leaders what makes sense for them, and then also our superintendents as well. And so there's a lot of co-creation in that process, and I think that's really important to either be community-led, student-led, teacher-led, or also system leader informed policies, practices, and strategies. So I think that's really important too. I think the last thing is that as you look at different aspects of the policy within your own state, I know that in the charter sector we're always looking at how to respond to things where we may feel like we are not equitably funded, where we may not have access to facilities that are sustainable for our schools, or even the autonomies that we hold, is to really truly hold on to the autonomy that you do have within the charter sector, and working with your authorizers to be able to understand what does that look like in the frame of equity. I think that's really important. And our authorizers also thinking this way, are they thinking more kind of getting pulled into the notion of like there's a single measure that we all have to meet. There's only one way to think about student success. So the more holistic and the more broad we can be in really raising up our mission-specific goals and indicators and outcomes, I think the stronger all schools would be. So I think those are some of the implications I would say that would be specific to the school leaders within those terms.
Thank you. So we have about 10 minutes left in this panel. I'd like to open it up to a couple questions if folks have any. Questions? There should be a microphone floating. There's a couple here. Rafe, go ahead and give her. Yeah.
Good morning. Can you hear me? Thanks
Barely.
for,
Look close.
I'd like to thank the panel for being here. My name is Dr. Sandy Roth. I'm the co-director of Albuquerque Charter Academy. We are a dropout recovery high school that's just a couple miles away from here, right in downtown Albuquerque on MLK and Broadway. We're in our 16th year of operation. So I could list the statistics of our student population that are likely similar to most of the school leaders in the room. We've got, but I'll just list a couple of them. 2/3 of our students are 18 and over. And so we serve mostly adults, and 100% of our students are not on track to graduate on time when they enroll in our school if their cohort date hadn't already passed. Our population is among the most vulnerable in the state. 99% of our students live below the poverty line. We have an extremely high majority of students who are living with some sort of disability, either a learning disability or a medical disability or an emotional disability. We are pioneers in the work of trauma-informed schooling. Our curriculum is it's been culturally and linguistically responsive since our founding. That's part of our mission. We're doing very good work. Since April of this year, when the age cap passed, and since the lease assistance formula has changed, and particularly since the small school size adjustment has been changed, we went from being completely viable to not sure if we're going to open our doors next year. So, and I know that it's not only us. I know that most folks in most charters in New Mexico are in this situation. So we've got an independent, single site model. We already have an extended school year. We already have an extended school day. We already have intensive remediation. We already have a strong emphasis on mental and social and emotional wellness. So everything that Martinez Yazzie wants us to move, we already have an equity council and have for many years. So this is the work that we're already doing. And so and I'm hearing you say, and I'm hearing the PED say that you're supporting the work of charters. However, we really are in such dire straits right now that I think the state might lose one of its most valuable resources in moving toward actually reaching the aims of Martinez Yazzie. And so we continue to invite folks to come into our school and to see what we're doing and to try to help us understand how, when we're already trying to meet these goals and we're already equity minded, why at the same exact time we're being legislatively attacked constantly since the beginning of this administration.
And so your question is?
My question is, how is it that at the same time that the state is telling us that you're supporting the aims behind Martinez Yazzie, that the legislative agenda is such that it is attacking schools that are already trying to meet those
Implement
aims?
some of those things. Thoughts about that? Essentially, there are schools, and you spoke to it, Myra, and you did as well. There are schools who are doing many things, moving towards equity. And there's a sense that some of the legislative work is not supportive of moving that work, is really supporting and moving that work. You have any thoughts about that in terms of her question about that?
I mean, I think we can definitely learn from any school that's doing this work really, really well, and we've seen that within the charter sector that there are many, and so that's an aim that the department can take on. I think as far as the legislative process, that's really up to our legislators to think about the policies that they're passing and how are they thinking about supporting these efforts, and so I think raising those examples up is something that we can do as they ask for different models of schools that are doing things well. So that's one thing we can do. I would think the second thing would be to connect you with folks that are on those various committees and associations that are already involved in that work and working through the legislative process. Because really, I mean, we get whatever funding comes out of the session, whatever policy comes out of the session, and at that point we can start to disseminate that and then think about how we provide guidance and support for those things that are passed at that level. So I think those are, those need to I think those should connect more closely, I would say, and then revisit, we're almost at the end of the first semester to try to think about what does it look like going into the spring and next school year for you, and really be able to articulate that and share that back to different folks who are asking us about the impact of what the policies that they made this past session and how are they actually impacting those schools. So that's something we can do. Do you have anything? No?
I just want to add that I think that the point that you're making is also all the more reason why we need some comprehensive planning around this issue. I mean, there's the court's decision is that all at-risk children, and it's defined as the 4 student groups that we've mentioned, have to have the opportunity to be college and career ready. And part of the legislative response was to say, we're going to comply with Yazzie Martinez by making these changes in the funding formula and adding some money here, and then they took away money in other places, which is what you're referring to, and also what you were referring to. And the legislature said this is all about complying with Yazzie Martinez, and that's not really a genuine response. There's nothing in the lawsuit that talks about whether charters should have more or less money. The lawsuit talks about at-risk students being served. And what we really need is some state leadership and some state leadership then coordinating all of these efforts. And so now when folks come to me with these individual, and it's not really individual because each issue is huge, like around the charter schools, around licensing, around how we evaluate schools, I'm really hopeful that we're going to have an opportunity to really pound every piece of this out and put it all in one place, and that the leaders in our state then are working towards all of these goals in a big coordinated effort. So I think that the time will come when these sorts of problems can be solved, but we haven't gotten there yet because we haven't seen the kind of leadership that we need yet.
Yeah, quickly.
All I want to say, we saw the writing on the wall, so we had to grow, but with that growth, there's been challenge, and so, you know, the magic number for charter schools is between 650 and 700. If we were able to actually have access to some of our at-risk funding, we might be able to be less than that, but that's what we had to do, and we did that about 7 years ago, and it's been hard.
Okay. Last word? So I'd love to give these folks more time, but there's a dynamic program that you all will have benefit from for the rest of today. So please give our panelists a round of applause. I want to thank you all for being here. Thank you for experiencing Albuquerque. Those of you who are not from here, please have a wonderful rest of your conference.